Have you ever walked into a room and suddenly felt like everyone else knew something you didn't? And what if the truth waiting for you in that room had been carefully arranged, like a scene in a play, where you were the only one who didn't know the script? My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 35 years old. I live in Chicago. And until that night, I believed my life was simple, predictable, even secure. I worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of job that kept me busy but satisfied. I had been married to my husband, Daniel Morgan, for 7 years. For most of those years, I believed we had the kind of marriage people quietly hoped for. Stable, respectful, maybe not dramatic, but dependable. Daniel came from a family that valued appearances and tradition, and at the center of that family stood his mother, Margaret Morgan. Margaret had always been a commanding presence, elegant, confident, the type of woman who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. Family gatherings revolved around her decisions, her plans, her expectations. Over the years, I had learned to keep the peace, to smile, to adapt, because maintaining harmony seemed easier than challenging her authority. The evening that would change everything was Margaret's 65th birthday celebration. The party was held at a luxury restaurant overlooking the Chicago River, a place known for its sweeping glass windows and glittering skyline views. When Daniel and I arrived, the entrance was wrapped in gold ribbons that shimmered under soft lights. Inside, crystal chandeliers scattered reflections across polished floors. White lilies filled the air with a delicate scent, and somewhere in the background, a violinist played slow, elegant melodies that drifted through the room. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, from the moment we stepped through the doors, something inside me tightened. Daniel's hand rested on the small of my back as we walked in, but it felt strangely stiff, almost rehearsed, not affectionate, not distant either, just formal, like we were performing for an audience. I noticed how he avoided meeting my eyes, how his smile seemed forced whenever someone greeted us. At first I told myself I was imagining it, but then other memories began surfacing in the back of my mind, late meetings that stretched longer than they should have, phone screens quickly turned face down when I entered the room, messages that appeared and disappeared before I could ask questions. Small things I had pushed aside, because trusting him felt easier than confronting doubt. The dining hall was already full when we entered. Relatives, family, friends, business associates, faces I recognized, but whose names I barely remembered filled every table. Conversations blended together into a warm, buzzing noise under the glow of crystal lights. And then my eyes drifted toward the head table, the place reserved for the closest members of the family. For a moment, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. Sitting beside Margaret, in the seat meant for someone important to the family, was a woman I recognized instantly, Emily Carter. I had seen her before, in passing moments that never quite made sense. But seeing her there, smiling comfortably beside my mother-in-law, felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. And in that moment, as the noise of the room continued around me, my eyes locked on the woman sitting beside my mother-in-law. It was Emily Carter. For a brief second, I wondered if I had misunderstood what I was seeing, the way your mind sometimes tries to soften a truth that feels too sharp. But the longer I looked, the clearer everything became. I had seen Emily before, not in places that made sense, but in fragments that had never quite settled in my mind. A name that flashed on Daniel's phone before the screen turned dark. A woman I once passed in a lobby who seemed strangely familiar when Daniel stiffened beside me. Small coincidences that I had pushed away because trusting my husband felt safer than questioning him. Yet here she was, not hiding, not avoiding attention, but sitting calmly at the head table. And not just anywhere at the table. She was seated in the chair directly beside Margaret, the chair normally reserved for family, the place where, in past gatherings, I had always been expected to sit. My gaze dropped for a moment to the polished tablecloth in front of her, and that was when I saw it, a small card placed neatly beside her plate. Her name was written on it in elegant lettering. Emily Carter. It was not an accident. It was not confusion. Someone had planned this carefully, down to the smallest detail. The realization spread slowly through me, like cold water moving under ice. I lifted my eyes and looked around the room. Conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and the violin music drifted through the air, just as it had before. Yet something in the faces around me told another story. A few relatives avoided looking directly at me, suddenly interested in their drinks or the decorations. Others watched with quiet curiosity, their expressions cautious, as if they were waiting to see what I would do. And what struck me most was that no one seemed surprised. No one gasped. No one questioned why a stranger was sitting in a place meant for someone else. It felt as if the entire room had already accepted this arrangement long before I walked through the door. At the center of it all, Margaret Morgan sat gracefully in her chair, smiling as she spoke to Emily with warm familiarity. Her posture was relaxed, confident, as though she were introducing a beloved guest into the family, rather than presenting the woman who had quietly entered my marriage. For a moment I simply watched them together, noticing how naturally Emily leaned toward her, how easily they laughed. Then, beside me, Daniel's voice broke through the noise. "Rachel," he whispered, low and urgent. I felt his hand move slightly, trying to guide me away from the table, as though he hoped to shield me from the scene that was already unfolding in front of everyone. But the moment had already arrived. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like thunder inside my chest. The lights above seemed brighter, harsher, and the voices around me blurred into a distant hum. The room didn't truly move, yet it felt as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted just enough to make everything unsteady. And in that suspended second, a calm and terrifying clarity settled inside me. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a mistake in seating arrangements or an awkward coincidence. It was deliberate, carefully arranged, public. What I was witnessing was not simply a betrayal hidden in shadows. It was humiliation placed in the brightest seat in the room. And once that realization settled inside me, something unexpected happened. I didn't explode. I didn't shout or demand explanations the way people imagine in scenes like this. Instead, an unfamiliar calm spread through me, quiet and cold, like the still surface of a lake before a storm. My heart was still racing, but my mind suddenly felt clear. In that clarity, I understood something that hurt more than the betrayal itself. My mother-in-law knew. The careful seating, the name card, the relaxed smiles around the table, none of it could exist without intention. And if Margaret knew, then it was impossible that others hadn't noticed. The room was full of relatives, family, friends, people who had watched Daniel and me build our life together over the past 7 years. Yet not one of them seemed surprised. That realization settled in my chest, heavier than anger. It meant the humiliation unfolding in front of me was not accidental. It had been accepted, maybe even anticipated. Daniel's voice came again beside me, quieter now, almost pleading. "Rachel, wait." His hand tightened slightly at my back, as if he hoped to guide me away before anyone else noticed the moment stretching between us. But everyone had already noticed. I could feel it in the silence that slowly crept across the nearest tables, in the cautious glances that flickered toward me and then quickly away. For a brief moment, I considered speaking, asking the question that was already burning in my mind. But I realized something just as quickly. No answer offered in that room could restore what had already been broken. So instead, I leaned slightly closer to Daniel and spoke in a voice calm enough that only he could hear it. "Enjoy the evening." The words were simple, almost polite, yet they carried more finality than any argument I could have made. Then I turned around and began walking toward the exit. I felt the shift in the room as I moved, conversations pausing, forks resting quietly against plates. The violin music continued, but it sounded distant now, like an echo fading behind me. Dozens of eyes followed my steps across the polished floor, but I kept my gaze forward, refusing to offer anyone the spectacle they might have expected. By the time I reached the glass doors, the warmth of the dining hall had already begun to fade from my skin. Outside, the Chicago night wrapped around me with a cool, steady breeze rising from the river. The air felt sharp and grounding, as if the world itself were reminding me to breathe. Only then did my phone begin to vibrate in my hand. Daniel's name flashed across the screen once, then again, and again. I walked slowly along the quiet sidewalk while the calls continued, each vibration echoing through the silence of the street. By midnight, he had called 81 times. 81 attempts to reach me, to explain, to apologize, maybe even to control the story before it spread further. I declined every call, one by one. Each time the screen lit up, I pressed the same quiet button and watched the call disappear. Eventually, I opened my settings and blocked his number completely. The silence that followed felt different from the silence inside the restaurant. This one belonged to me. I didn't cry that night. The tears would come later, in quieter hours when the world slowed down. But in that moment, standing under the city lights, with the river wind brushing past me, I felt something unexpected growing inside my chest. Not relief, not happiness, something stronger. For the first time that evening, I felt power returning to me, and for the first time that evening, standing beneath the quiet glow of the city lights, I felt a strange sense of control returning to me. That feeling stayed with me long after the street emptied and the night slowly faded into morning. When I woke up the next day, sunlight was already slipping through the curtains of my apartment, filling the room with the calm, golden light. The city outside moved as it always did, cars passing, distant horns, the quiet rhythm of Chicago waking up to another ordinary day. Yet inside me, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Something fundamental had shifted during the night, something that could not be undone. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the restaurant with a clarity that felt almost surgical. The glittering chandeliers, the polite smiles, the soft violin music drifting through the room, and Emily Carter sitting calmly in the seat that should have belonged to me. The humiliation was still there, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it, something else had begun to grow. Understanding. By late morning, my phone began ringing again, this time with unfamiliar numbers and familiar names. Friends called first, their voices filled with disbelief and concern. A few of them hesitated before speaking, as if searching for the right words, but eventually the truth slipped out between their careful sentences. Some of them had suspected something for months. They had noticed the tension between Daniel and me, the way Emily's name occasionally surfaced in conversations where it didn't quite belong. Hearing that didn't bring comfort. Instead, it opened a second wound, quieter but deeper, because it meant the betrayal had not begun that night at the restaurant. It had been unfolding quietly long before I realized it. By the afternoon, Members of Daniel's family began reaching out as well. Their messages carried a different tone, careful explanations, vague attempts to soften what had happened. Some suggested there had been confusion about seating arrangements. Others insisted emotions had simply run too high, and that I had reacted too quickly by leaving. But as I listened to their words, I realized something important. None of them were truly denying what had happened. They were only trying to reshape it into something less painful, something easier to excuse. And that was when the final truth settled into place. The most painful part of that night had not been discovering Daniel's betrayal. It was realizing that Margaret Morgan had known about it and had chosen to display it openly. That chair at the head table had not been a mistake. It had been a message. In the quiet hours that followed, I found myself remembering details from the past year that suddenly made sense. Daniel's late meetings that never seemed to end. The way he guarded his phone like a secret. The subtle defensiveness that appeared whenever I asked simple questions. Each memory was a small thread, and when woven together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Betrayal rarely arrives like thunder. More often, it creeps in quietly, disguised as ordinary life, until one moment pulls the curtain away. For me, that moment had been a single chair at a single table. Yet strangely, what they intended to be my humiliation became something entirely different. It became the beginning of my freedom. Because when you finally refuse to participate in your own disrespect, something powerful happens. The fear that once kept you silent disappears, and in its place comes clarity. And that clarity returns something that can never be taken from you again: your power.